So far we've looked at our public lands and how we use and manage those. Now we're going to look at our urban areas and talk about how we can use them and develop them more sustainably. So looking at patterns of urbanization will help us understand what we need to do to make them more sustainable. What we're seeing is our urban areas are increasing in the levels of poverty. More and more poor people are migrating to urban areas. So a few statistics. Between 1850 and 2002, we increased the number of people living in our urban areas from 2% to 47%. We think that by 2050, 63% of all people will live in urban areas. Right now we have about 1 billion people that live in slums, where you have basically shacks that are built from any materials that they can find. They're built on top of each other, and usually you have 3 to 6 people living in one room. So here's an example of what one of these slums or shanty towns look like. It's extreme poverty, so they live in these slums where they don't have water supplies, they're not connected to city water or sewage, they don't have services, they usually get electricity illegally. Here's another picture. This is Mumbai in India, and you can see the shanty towns and the slums that just surround that central urban area. Looking at the major urban areas of the world, what they did with this map is they took satellite pictures at night, and you can see where the lights are tend to be where our larger cities are. And the numbers in yellow, or the estimated populations in 2004, and then the projected for 2015. So you can see where our largest cities are. Right now, about 47% of the world's population lives on only 2% of Earth's land area. And here's another view where you can see the major cities. All right, so there is good news to urbanization. When people move to cities, they're going to have better access to services like medical care, education. Usually they have better working and living conditions, better sanitation. So with sanitation and medical care, death rates have dropped. And transmittable diseases have decreased. When we have a large number of people living on a small percentage of our land, that also helps reduce destruction and degradations of habitats outside of those urban areas. But of course, with the good news, there's bad news. Urban areas tend to have a high resource input, so they actually depend on those other lands, and a high waste output. They consume a majority of the world's resources. They don't have many trees, and so productivity is low. They don't produce their own food, so once again, that's something that they have to input from the outer areas. When you have a lot of people living in a small area, that can lead to water resource problems. The proximity of people to each other, you get a spread of disease. What we also see in our urban areas is what we call the urban heat island effect. Urban areas tend to be warmer than the surrounding. Part of that's because they have less vegetation, they have more asphalt and darker materials to absorb sunlight, but they also have more exhaust and emissions to help trap that heat as well. High poverty levels, higher levels of unemployment in our urban areas. And then what we see are people that move outside of the cities but still commute into work, and that leads to something that we call urban sprawl, and really leads to that dependency on cars. So we mentioned that urban areas have a high inputs. They have to input their energy, so their electricity, whatever their source is, whether it's coal or nuclear. They input their food because they don't have the farmland, usually water, raw materials, and then their outputs, all of the waste from that, waste heat, solid waste, air pollution, water pollution, and so on. So urban sprawl is where you see that low density development, so apartment complexes, housing developments, strip malls, fast foods, restaurants, and really encourages dependence on cars. Usually you see this in areas where you have a central urban area and then you have belt lines surrounding it. Atlanta is a great example. Raleigh on a smaller scale, you've got your downtown area, then you have your 440 belt line and your 540 belt line. And what we've seen as 540 has been constructed are developments and shopping centers. Knightdale is a great example. When 540 moved through Knightdale, we saw a lot of shopping centers show up, apartment complexes. Triangle Town Center was built right along 540 when it opened up as it crossed Capitol Boulevard. And we continue to see people moving further and further outside of downtown Raleigh in the Triangle area. And so we really depend on our roads to commute from one place to another. These are two maps. This first one is of Las Vegas. And this second one is of Las Vegas, but it's between the 1970s and 2000, so about a 30-year period. You can see how urban sprawl has really occurred. And keep in mind that Las Vegas is in the middle of the Mojave Desert, so not a lot of resources in this area, especially water. So they depend on the Hoover Dam and Lake Mead to provide the water needs of this thriving city in the middle of the desert. Another thing that can happen as cities sprawl outward, they actually run into each other, and we see that if you've ever driven on Highway Interstate 95 up north, one city, once you get to DC all the way up through Boston, one city pretty much runs into the other. So that you've got from DC up through Boston, and there's another one running from Chicago east to Pittsburgh, and these cities have just sprawled into each other. So the urban heat island, we mentioned that cities are warmer, they also tend to be rainier, foggier, and clouder. They have more condensation nuclei, or like dust and solid particulates, for moisture to condense on that forms that fog and clouds. So not only do we have the dark materials absorbing energy, but we have more heat being generated by the factories and the cars. One of the things we can do to counter this, planting more trees, using lighter colored roofing and paving, introducing more high efficiency standards on cars and buildings. Looking at this picture here, this is of a city in Germany. You can see the green on top of the buildings. They have a lot of gardens on the roofs, both for residential and office buildings. If we look at how land use planning has traditionally occurred in the U.S., that has led to this urban sprawl where you have roads moving outward, people are living away from their workplace and commuting in. And usually they encourage development in the outer areas by lowering property taxes. Instead of this conventional urban sprawl, we want to move toward what is called smart growth. And smart growth protects those outer areas and also reduces the dependence on cars. So we want to take account everything in the area, the geological, ecological, economic, social factors, and somehow be able to meet the needs while decreasing the dependence on cars. So looking at this diagram as an example, this is mixed use. You see residential, retail, and office all in the same area. So the idea is that you live, work, and play without having to get in your car and drive long distances. We see neighborhoods like this popping up. North Hills of Six Forks is a great example. There are homes, there's condos, there's apartments, there's office buildings, there's shopping, there's entertainment, movie theaters, all of that together in one location, and the idea is that you don't have to get in your car and drive every time you have a need. Eco-cities are planned cities that take all of these things into account. And as opposed to using cars, people are walking, biking, or the key thing is using mass transit to get from one place to another. This is a model of an eco-city. This is not an existing city. But one existing city that we are going to look at is Curitiba, Brazil. But the idea is to keep these cities sustainable is to make sure they're built around people. You want them to walk, use mass transit, use renewable energy resources. To cut down on the waste output, we want to use things like solar power, using wetlands for wastewater treatment, recycling the water. cutting down on the amount of pollution and reducing waste. And we can do that by reusing and recycling some of our solid waste. Using greenhouses and, once again, those community gardens, either in vacant lots or on rooftops, to help produce food, to cut down on the amount that we have to input into the cities. And then, of course, planting trees. So looking at Curitiba, Brazil, the way the city is set up is that everything is along a bus line. About 70% of the 2 million people in the city use the bus system. So they have these high-rise apartments that the bottom 2 floors are stores, grocery stores, clothing, movie theaters, all types of entertainment. So they don't even have to leave their building. But if they do, they have bike paths. They have bus systems. They don't even allow cars on many of their downtown blocks. Their bus system is set up, if you look in this diagram, they have the city center, and then it's almost like spokes of a wheel. So these are the residential areas, and the bus lines go out into each of these areas and then transport people to and from the city center. They have express lanes on the roads that do allow cars. They're double and triple length buses, and you can see it almost looks like you're getting on and off a subway. Extra wide doors so people can get on and off at the same time. They don't look like the buses that we have here. All right, so our goal is in land use planning is sustainable development, and depending on who you are, that might mean something different. One definition is that development that meets the current needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And this is similar to our definition of sustainability in terms of resource use. We want to make sure we're meeting our needs, but we're not using resources faster so they're not running out for future generations. Now, an environmentalist and economists are going to look at this 2 different ways. Economists are going to make sure that you have a stable annual return on your investment. So they're looking at the money point of view, whereas environmentalists are looking at whether or not you're experiencing environmental degradation. So ideally, we would want a combination of the 2.